We've got 4 terrific speakers today. Yesterday we had a panel of conservators. Today we have a really interesting mixture of conservators and people whose experience, whether strategic or curatorial or academic, bears on this subject. The speakers are Anaïs Aguerre, who's the founder and managing director of Culture Connect, which is a consultancy which is dedicated to furthering international collaboration in the culture sector. Prior to the founding of Culture Connect, she was the head of international initiatives at the V&A, where she was project director for the Sheku project to found the design gallery in China. But perhaps most relevant today for our discussion, she has, since leaving the V&A, been the director of the REACH project, which is a global initiative on the reproduction of art and cultural heritage, which has been spearheaded by the V&A. Donal Cooper, let's give us a wave, Donal, is a university lecturer at Cambridge University in Italian Renaissance art, and he's a fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge. His published work and research has largely focused on Italian art from around 1250 to 1500, 1550, published widely on Giotto. But he's also very interested in the application of digital media to recovering and communicating the original context of artworks. He was involved in the digital reconstruction, for instance, of San Pier Maggiore, the church in Florence, for the Botticini exhibition at the National Gallery. And he's been involved in a project called Inspire 2020 at the Fitzwilliam Museum, which has used AR technology to communicate conservation and its possibilities regarding a panel painting by Giacomo del Celaio. Bart Devolder is Conservator of Collections at Princeton University Art Museum. Bart was, prior to joining Princeton in 2018, I think that's right, Bart, he was the on-site coordinator and the painting conservator for the restoration of the Ghent altarpiece by Hubert and Jan van Eyck, which obviously has been so much in the spotlight this year. But of course, that project was something that has been in gestation and been in the works and been worked on for around more than around 8 years, I suppose, Bart. Yeah. He's particularly interested in new applications of computer sciences to studying old masters, so that will have relevance today, certainly. And Jennifer Mass, last but not least, they're in alphabetical order. Jen is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Cultural Heritage Science at Bard Graduate Center. She's also the president of Scientific Analysis of Fine Art, SAFA, or is it SAFA? Do you call it SAFA? Which she founded in 2007 with the aim of helping to offer objective material analysis of works that might be circulating in the art market. And she's been working recently on the Scream, amongst other things, and on Munch at the behest of the Munch Museum. I think partly because Jen is one of the world experts on cadmium yellow, which is a rather wonderful thing to be able to be. So I've asked all of our participants, our panelists, to provide one slide, like yesterday, that gives us a talking point into the subject and to give us 1 or 2 minutes on why they've selected it. So I'm going to hand straight over to Anaïs.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be here. And indeed, as it was introduced at the beginning, and maybe the sort of a little bit on the margin, as I'm not a conservator myself, but I've been diving into the world of digital reproduction and heritage. And the image I've chosen is a combination of an element to remind us that we are indeed looking at sort of the time passing. So we are very much going to talk about sort of the past, what we are doing now. But I think one of the elements, thinking also a little bit about the ethics of what we are doing, is really to think about what we are looking at creating, because all the interventions and the work we're doing today is in some way shaping the heritage of tomorrow. And I think that's some of the point I would love us to be able to talk about. And the second element is the cover of an excellent exhibition that was curated by Brendan Cormier, with a curator at the V&A, called A World of Fragile Part, which was presented at the Venice Biennale in 2016. And that's really the starting point of this project that you've mentioned, Tom, called REACH, so Reproduction of Art and Cultural Heritage, which I had the honor to lead on behalf of the V&A. And the whole idea and the premise of this work really started with this exhibition in Venice, where Brandon really sort of looked at the kind of tension around cultural heritage and all the threats, being sort of terrorism, wars, mass tourism, pollution, that were basically threatening our shared human heritage and cultural heritage. And through this work, he reconnected very much the V&A with the history that the museum had since the 19th century, with the notion and the history of reproduction. And so the starting point of the REACH initiative was really to come back to a seminal convention called the Henry Cole Convention that the founding director of the V&A started in 1867, where he noticed major change in digital, in sort of technical advances of the time, namely photography, electrotypes, a new technique for casting object, which really led to sort of a big movement of cast collections in major museums around the world, and really sort of rethinking the way we were sort of exchanging this cultural heritage and using that as sort of portable patrimony of our shared cultural heritage. So I choose that because it has really been sort of the starting point of looking at how in the 21st century, with the fourth industrial revolution, our sector could really embrace technical advances to better do its work of studying, preserving, and sharing culture.
So thanks, Anaïs. There are lots of things that I want to come back to there. One of them is this idea about how much we know about the technologies that we have, especially new technologies. And certainly I'm hoping that the conversation and the conversations that continue in the breakout sessions will think about how far the types of data and information that are being created in this field should be shared and can be shared, and what might be the limitations to that. I'm going to move on to Donal now.
Hello, and thank you, Tom, for the invitation to participate this evening. I too am not a conservator, although I'm very fortunate to be able to work with wonderful conservation colleagues at Cambridge in the Fitzwilliam Museum and the Hamilton Carr Institute. As Tom indicated, I've been interested in various digital approaches to trying to recover and reconstruct contexts for paintings in my field, Renaissance Italy. And I wanted to flag a little project that we ran recently in Cambridge in connection with an exhibition curated by my colleague at the Fitz, Kate Noble, in the Education and Learning Department, which focused on this painting of by a Cassone painting, one of the Fitz's Renaissance paintings, and tried to really focus on its materiality and the techniques that went and materials that went into making it. And actually, most of the exhibition was concentrated around getting school children to engage in this, and which was wonderful. But we saw an opportunity, I think, to try to bring some of the conservation work, some of the technical analysis that had been undertaken into the gallery space. And you can see we created this little smartphone app which had various different layers on it, which allowed visitors to, in a sense, scan the painting themselves to see the IR scans, to see the underdrawing, the changes, and also the X-rays to see nails embedded into the picture as if they were scanning the object themselves. It's very simple, really. You see there, it's very much a collaborative effort. I draw your attention to the other names there. Paolo Ricciardi, the conservation scientist at the FITS, Dampet, head of digital. Giovanni Pescamona was the researcher at the University of Florence, who was instrumental in creating the app. And he's actually with us this evening, so we might be able to have the chance to ask him questions as well. But it's very simple. It doesn't really use very advanced technology, simple image recognition, a nice software development kit to give you a nice stable sensation with the phone, but potentially one very interesting way to bring in the kind of what we know to be the kind of key pieces of conservation technical analysis evidence into the hands of the gallery viewer.
I'm very interested in how this project and others like it does exactly what you said, just puts it in the hands and allows people to imagine that they almost have some ownership over that technology and access to that information. We come back to that, I hope. Bart, onto your slide.
Yes, since it's one slide, I had to choose, I opted to choose just like a detail from this website called Closer to Van Eyck, which hopefully some of you have visited over the past years. And I actually used it to illustrate what this website actually started, because the website was there before the conservation treatment, which started in 2012 by the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Brussels. But what I'm trying to say is that the information that was obtained prior to doing the conservation was already put in this website, and thanks to big efforts of Ron Spronk, which was actually at that point just people could zoom in, as you can see on the screen here, on the details. You could compare infrared images, infrared photography, infrared reflectography, and X-ray. And what we did with the team, because obviously I was not the only conservator for the Ghent Altarpiece project, we kind of took that openness, meaning we share the information almost as fast as we can. Obviously, it takes some time to stitch these images together, put them on the website. But we kind of took that idea of openness, and this is not a new idea. I think most big treatments now almost have some sort of open component. But we really focused on having the whole Ghent Altarpiece project to be open to the public. So when we were working, people could come and see us, not in the weekends, in the museum in Ghent. And for the same thing, we were trying to not hide things. On the contrary, we were trying to maybe demystify our profession of conservator a little bit by showing what we actually do. And I think this is definitely the right way in doing it. I understand this was a big project, so we had the funding, thanks to many sponsors, to do it this way. But I think there is something to be said about sharing information as soon as it becomes available. And this is a lot of information. There's a lot of technical evidence that can be shared. But more importantly, this website then got used to be built upon with the Verona project, which is the Van Eyck and Open Research. This is a component. If you go to the website, you can choose between the different modules. And what that does is that the team of the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage went around the world and captured all other Van Eyck paintings or related paintings with the same equipment. This might maybe not be the best equipment available, but it's all standard. It's the same equipment. And what the team was not trying to do was to be judgmental about it. It was just that, capturing the information with the same standards and sharing that information as soon as possible without making a judgment call. And this has been very successful. We've had over 6,000 visitors a month, which is huge. But even more important, I think, is that the average visitor stayed 30 minutes on this website, which is truly amazing. I think most of those numbers are probably the team, because I want to say that too. We as a team the conservation team, while working, actually access the computer ourselves, because it's so user-friendly to have these 3 different modalities of visual, infrared, and X-ray at the same time. We also noticed, for example, when the COVID crisis hit, that this started peaking, and the website actually had up to 60,000 visitors a month since the COVID crisis. So yeah, I think it was a good initiative, and it keeps on giving.
I'm really interested in what you say about something quite simple, which is how the database, as it were, the website, becomes a continual tool that keeps on teaching the people who are involved in the project. Jen, let's move on to your slide, and then we open some discussion up.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here, Tom. As Tom mentioned, I'm not a conservator. I'm a scientist in decorative arts and material culture department, which is somewhat unusual. And one of the things that we do at Bart Graduate Center is we try to invert the hierarchy, the traditional hierarchy of the arts, and really try and put paintings in the context of objects instead of the other way around. And so it just so happened that this painting that I've been studying for the past several years, the circa 1910 version of The Scream from the Monk Museum, was sort of a perfect example of how we try to understand works of art at Bard. And so typically when you go into a museum, you're often seeing a painting, a magnificent painting, in this case against a white wall, and it's pulled out of its cultural context and its social context, and then in many ways its material context. So I absolutely love this 1903 image of The Scream installed the way that Edvard Munch envisioned this painting to be viewed, which is part of his overall frieze of life. And so the paintings in the frieze were not always installed in the same order, and not all of them were always there, but this is sort of the circa 1903 version of the frieze at Leipzig. And what I wanted to point out here was the phenomenal secessionist furniture in this room, and the wall coverings and the paneling and all of the context of the painting, all of the feeling of the moment that you don't get to see when you're viewing a painting by itself against a white wall. And that's one of the things that really excites me about some of the technologies we're going to talk about this afternoon, whether it's augmented reality or virtual reality. We often think of a period room as sort of a time machine, the ability to step back into the past and experience in 3 dimensions what the past was like. And I think that these new technologies will enable us to do something similar without the pain and the expense of having to reproduce an entire period room. One of the things that I do as a scientist is to try and uncover what the painting would have looked like at the time that the artist made it. And what I'm pointing out in the lower left of the screen is all of the areas that have changed in the painting over time. Probably most notable, a lot of the yellows have faded to an ivory color, and you can see a digital reproduction of what the sky would have looked like at the upper right, brushstroke that's faded to, again, that ivory tone, and the bright yellow that the pigment would have been originally. And that's another thing that I'm really excited about doing with this type of technology. We often think about, when we're looking at a painting, like I think a lot of us are familiar with the geranium lake used by Van Gogh and how quickly that faded. The idea of using augmented reality to bring back Van Gogh's original vision in a way similar to what the Met did with their Van Gogh's irises and roses exhibit. I thought that was really a successful exhibit. And then one of the things that I do as a scientist is I generate the elemental and molecular information about the paint to understand the work better. And so what you're looking at the bottom of your screen is a paint cross-section where the red data points are oxygen. This is of the yellow paint. The green are sulfur, and the blue is chlorine. And this should be pure cadmium yellow, which is cadmium sulfide. And in fact, we see that the paint has mostly become cadmium carbonate and cadmium chloride to understand why that occurred, we actually took the image at the right, which is literally looking at individual cadmium and sulfur atoms. So we've gone down to the atomic level to understand why Edvard Munch's paint was so sensitive to degradation. And so I'm looking forward to the possibility of using augmented reality to actually pull the viewer out to the room scale to see the entire context of the painting, and then back down to the atomic scale to understand why it looks the way it does today.
Thank you very much, Jen, and to all of you for these short presentations. I want to pick up many of the things that have come out of those slides. I wanted actually first of all to ask Bart, because this line that I plucked from your biography on the Princeton website, that you're interested in the application of computer sciences to the conservation of old master paintings. Can you give us a sort of broad scope of what that actually it might mean?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, that is a very fascinating thing that happened almost accidentally. But when we were doing the Ghent altarpiece in collaboration with the University of Ghent, we were approached by the mathematics department saying, we did this with the Ghent altarpiece. And what this was they had created a mathematical equation that would automatically detect all the cracks in the painting. But what they had done was they had then give those cracks that they detected a specific color element, and therefore virtually in painting the painting. But it had turned the painting into the most garish thing I'd ever seen. And you know, for the people that know me on this call, I normally don't weigh my words. So we kind of expressed that we thought that was a great idea, but a conservator would almost never, ever in-paint cracks that are created by age. And so we embarked on this path to see if we could learn the computer to differentiate between cracks created by aging, drying cracks, and losses. Because losses, as a restorer, we would infill and in-paint. And so, yeah, we worked on it for 3 or 4 years, and it's still ongoing research, but several articles have come out of this. And it's a little bit scary to see how quickly the computer can learn these different approaches if you teach it how to learn it with all kind of deep learning modules. And luckily, I think for us humans, is that we are still needed, because that was my scary experience after 3 years of research. What I seen, what the computer did before and afterwards. The in-painting computer now suggests when we input a detail of the Ghent altarpiece, it's pretty good. Whether we would use that, that's a whole different discussion. But I think we were there as a conservator to help guide the mathematicians who were clearly on something useful, only they didn't really know what it was useful for. And to click into the blurb that was on the website of what we were going to do, the question about how tech companies might be interested is how it was interesting to see how some of these articles that were submitted to very high tech magazines said, but how is this useful for not art? And that's where it gets interesting. These techniques have been used, for example, in detection of, let's say, all kind of cancers and things, how we can learn the computer how to differentiate certain elements from others. So I think there is something to be said that it's a mutual thing, right? We can develop something and it can be used for many different uses.
I mean, this machine learning application is the first I've heard of it, and I'd love to know more about it. But I want to pass the ball back to Jennifer, because Jen, what Bart has said about new technologies and perhaps not always knowing the application of them for your work in relation to materiality. It struck me from your slide that you were talking about, there's an excitement about discovering what the technologies might make possible. Is it that you wait for somebody to come to you with a new technology, or are you kind of trying to follow what technologies are coming into you that might be applicable to your work?
That's a great question, and certainly when you think about cultural heritage science, really we're trying to be non-destructive. If we can avoid taking microsamples, we want to avoid taking microsamples, and we want to be portable. And when you think about some of the other disciplines that are doing that, the medical industry, it develops all kinds of non-destructive imaging techniques. If you even think historically about how CT scanning developed to scan a person is frequently used to scan objects of art to understand them. Certainly we do look to medical technology quite a bit. And then sort of on the other end of the spectrum, if you think about how the field has been so excited and generated a tremendous amount of wonderful information using hyperspectral imaging, that's something that really comes from astronomy. And so I feel like the combination of remote sensing and the biomedical fields are in some sense paving the way and developing new technologies that we can piggyback on a little bit.
Anaïs, in the REACH project, and obviously part of what you've worked on is the possibility of collaboration. It is fundamental to your work. How far has collaboration with the tech sector and the tech sector been trying to help make the running here, or do you feel that the museums and institutions have to reach out towards those companies and to the technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, and it was great to hear Bart example and how he worked hand in hand with people creating things. I think one of the main points, both a starting point and something that was really acute as we were doing sort of series of roundtable around the world, looking at sort of how our sector was embracing this new technology. I think there is a bit of still a bit of a tension sometimes between those two worlds, and I think one of the main things for us was to empower a bit more the cultural sector to be able to speak with more confidence with the tech world and make sure that they were also going to be part of the discussions. I think the example of the computer not knowing what to read and needing to have Bart and his colleague intervention to say, well, actually, technology can do that, but that's not really what we're after, is really important. And I think we are now, and probably the pandemic is going to also open a new chapter. I think there is a greater sense and understanding of the importance of embracing the digital revolution for the cultural and heritage sector. And I think for a long time, a lot of the innovation were coming from the margin of the museum. So a lot of conservators were very advanced and were pushing those topics, but sometimes they were not really welcomed by the leadership of the institution. And I think things are changing. In my view, this is critical that we create the right condition for a constructive dialogues between those worlds, because there is a risk that actually, because there is more financial means, there is a more a quicker way of turning things around in the tech world, that they are going to lead the way and create the framework within which the cultural and heritage sector will have to work. So I think creating moment and collaboration between those two worlds is critical. One way to do that is to offer access and trial and experiment things at a scale that museum can offer, either because they have collections which offer certain things, or because they have the ability to then sort of talk to a large public. So I think, yeah, creating the right collaboration condition between those two worlds is important, but there is an ongoing tension and the risk of those two worlds not speaking in a constructive way and not helping each other when they could.
Donal, I'm going to pass a similar question to you, because obviously you come from an academic art history background. It's what you teach and so on. This interest in the opportunities for tech to think about reconstruction and I suppose the relationship between original materiality and the current state of objects. Do you think that's been something that's for you been part of being in a university context, or where does it come from in your perspective?
I think I agree probably with Anaïs's comments that in many ways, I mean, this also is my own experience. You know, my grounding in digital humanities, as it were, where I got started was in a museum context at the V&A, in fact, and it's really through these collaborations, National Gallery, FITS, that this has been most fruitful. I think something that Anaïs said, which rang very true for me, is this kind of issue of with different speeds within, in the sense, the humanities world and the tech world. And very often we're under pressure working from the humanities side, as it were, in our applications of new digital technologies, always to be demonstrating something new also from the tech side. And many funding calls often are kind of privileging that in terms of the link ups that you can make with tech SMEs and so on. Whereas in fact, very often what we want to do is to kind of apply what it is we have. And it's quite important to be able to know that a technology or a hardware is stable enough that it's going to be around for a period of time. Otherwise, we end up in this kind of constant prototyping scenario, which is it does characterize a lot of work. So in many ways, you end up with lots of prototypes, but the actual really serious sustained projects are much rarer. And I think that's something which is important to think about, particularly in terms of widespread rolling out in teaching and public access as well.
I'm gonna move the conversation on, although there are many points I want to pick up already. Luckily, we have these breakout sessions to come back to things, because I want to talk about digital reproduction for a few minutes, which seems to me one of the big areas of growth in recent years, at least in terms of what has been communicated to the public. And let me ask, I will bring Anaïs in, but let me ask Bart perhaps, first of all. I mean, digital reproduction, which we've read a lot about, obviously has been something that the V&A and other museums have been working on, a sort of new version of what casting technology can make possible. Bart, is that something that you see a great application for, specifically in the field of conservation and conservation treatment?
I think so. I mean, in my relatively short career, I guess, I graduated in 2002. I've seen it used when I was at the Kimball in Texas, for example. We had a Maya stele that was purchased before 1970, but obviously this stele is, part of the cultural heritage of the people still there. And the Kimball had offered to have a digital reproduction made, so actually had the original stele scanned and had it made so that the reproduction could go and stand in the jungle there. But that's already like 10, 15 years ago. I think we can go much further, and from my initial conversations with the church wardens in Ghent, that is going to be part also of the new visitor center in Ghent for the Ghent altarpiece, because it would be nice if I envision it that visitors would go with Google glasses and would be able to open the Ghent altarpiece themselves in a virtual context. I think it would be extremely interesting, because people forget that those things had another meaning than just being a pretty object, and that they had a powerful presence, and that there is a reason why the outside panels are painted in a more mute color tonality and the interior so brightly, but you never have, as a visitor, that opportunity to experience that aha moment.
Anaïs, let me ask you, obviously the new declaration on reproduction of cultural heritage has many things to say about the internationalism, universality of objects, say about what it is to record them and to preserve against loss. But how far were conservation departments and conservators involved in the discussion, or were they sort of just one element of thinking about what reproduction makes possible?
Yeah, there were one element, so just for people to know, so the work we done was basically a series of roundtables across the world involving different people who may have a view on the notion of reproduction and its role for the cultural and heritage sector. So we had a conservator. I think to the point that has been made, I have sort of two comments to make. I think the possibilities of reproduction is an amazing opportunity for our sector to seize, both, as I said, from like a conservation perspective. I've seen many examples where you see the use of 3D modeling being used to work really well on sort of preventive conservation, and it's quite incredible to see how they could sort of predict and therefore sort of anticipate what might happen to the original object. Fantastic ways to do sort of education work and giving access to collections to enable multiple narrative to live at the same time on a digital platform. And I think all those things are really incredible, and that are really things that we need to push, and conservation is one big part of that. But if I come back to the point of conservation, I think we need to bear in mind, and that's something we outlined at the very beginning of this declaration, that what matters for us people who are about objects is the original object. And I think that's always the thing that sometimes we get carried away with all these shiny things we can do with technology. But the reality is that the original object is what matters, and those digital are just tools to help us to unpack the hidden stories around this object. We are able maybe today to see certain things in this object. Maybe in 100 years time, technology will enable us to discover things we can't see. So I think making sure that putting money and effort into digital heritage and digital reproduction shouldn't be preventing us to actually keep doing important work on the actual object. So I think my point about conservation and what emerged from this discussion is to make sure that our profession is about preserving and passing on this actual material object, and that digital is a way to enable us to do that better with sort of more creative ways, but that the original object is still key, because in 150 years time, we may need to come back to that and discover other things. If the object disappear, we won't be able to do that and carry on unlocking their secrets.
This is fascinating, the importance of sort of recording what we know and don't know about our own methods of recording. And Jennifer, let me ask you about this, perhaps just to follow on from what Anaïs has said, and thinking about, I loved what you were saying about the possibilities of reconstructing original colors digitally. I mean, how important is it for you to be conscious of the possible obsolescence or future obsolescence of the technology that you're using when you're working on these things?
It's certainly critical. I mean, one of the things that Anaïs said that really resonates with me is this idea of preservation versus access, and the tension that always goes on between the two. And I think that Donal brought this up a little bit as well, that we do have to keep an eye on the technology that we're using to make sure that it isn't something that's going to be obsolete so quickly that people are not going to have access to the work that we've done. And so this is always a challenge. One of the things that's been a continual challenge in the United States in terms of education is in the arts is just how large a country we are and where the collections are located. And something I've been working on with the Crest Foundation in terms of access is a technical art history curriculum that can be accessible to students throughout the United States. And so that if you're in Montana or Wyoming, and you're not going to be taking a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to see these objects in person, how can we bring technical art history to those people? And then all of a sudden, with COVID coming along, this became a much more pressing matter in terms of how we're going to grant access to students across the country, where now these types of trips to see the actual object are just impossible. And so I think this, Thomas, this goes back to your point that we have to make sure not only if the object is not accessible, that the technology is accessible, even to think about the bandwidth that you're going to need to load a specific program to be able to access three-dimensional images, scans of an object, for example.
This is fundamental, isn't it? The storage space to hold all the data, who has access to it. We can talk about transparency until the cows come home, but you know, data is only shared to the extent that people are able to access the portals to that data. Donal, was that something, I mean, the projects you've worked on, it seems to me that it's been quite important that they've been quite portable, that they've been quite shareable, that even at the Fitzwilliam, you didn't at that point have to bring your own smartphone along.
Yes, and that probably will be something that will have to change in the COVID scenario, because the phones were possible virus vectors, of course, so they had to disappear quite quickly in the shutdown earlier in the year. But I think there's no reason why this couldn't, if we were to publish it as a downloadable app, why it couldn't work on everyone's smartphones. And you know, not everyone has a smartphone, but you know, it is if you like, a kind of it's widespread enough to be able to assume that has very wide reach and access. So I think that's tremendously important in terms of an access point of view, and I think the kind of access agenda to the digital is tremendously important. Openness plus access, one doesn't really work so well without the other.